Step away from the vehicle, now! Burn!
I'm just pumping gas, officer.
I said step away. Hands where I can see them.
I haven't done anything wrong.
You fit the description.
That exchange happened on a Tuesday night in April at a gas station on Route 7 in Millfield, Georgia. The surveillance system above pump number 4 was recording in high definition. It captured every word you just heard. It captured what happened before those words, and it captured what happened after. The moment when Officer Craig Briggs made the worst decision of his professional life, and a 9-minute encounter that began with a routine call became the most documented case of police misconduct the county had ever seen. Before we get into what the cameras showed, I want to know where you are watching from right now. Leave your city in the comments below, and if this is your first time on this channel, hit that subscribe button, because stories like this one are exactly why we exist, and you do not want to miss what comes next. What you are about to hear destroyed one man's career, sent him to prison, forced an entire police department to restructure from the inside out, and gave the man at the center of it all a mission that he is still carrying out today. It started with a gas station. It ended with something much larger than that. Darnell Carter was 36 years old on the night this happened. He stood 6 feet 1 inch tall and carried himself with the particular stillness of someone who had learned through years of training and years of life in this country as a black man that how you move and how you speak can change outcomes in ways that should not be your responsibility to manage, but often are. He was not a man who drew attention to himself. He wore civilian clothes when he was not working, jeans, a gray hoodie, simple boots, because he preferred to move through the world without announcement. He had spent 11 years in a profession that required absolute discretion, and that habit had never left him. He had grown up in Savannah, Georgia, the second of 4 children raised by a woman named Patricia Carter who worked as a school administrator and who had the kind of quiet authority that made people straighten up when she walked into a room. His father, Raymond, had served in the Army for 12 years before working as a contractor. Military service was not a foreign concept in the Carter household. It was a language the family spoke fluently. Darnell enlisted in the Navy at 19. By 23, after surviving one of the most demanding selection processes in the American military, he had earned the right to call himself a Navy SEAL. The training alone, a program known as Basic Underwater Demolition, or BUD/S, had a voluntary dropout rate that historically hovered above 75%. The candidates who quit did not fail a physical test. They chose to ring a brass bell that sat at the training center, signaling that they were done. The bell was always there. The choice was always available. Darnell Carter never rang it. He served 11 years in the teams, 3 combat deployments. 2 to Afghanistan during active operations, 1 to Iraq during a period that his service record describes only in classifications that remain sealed. He participated in direct action missions, personnel recovery operations, and special reconnaissance assignments that will never appear in any publicly available document. He saved lives in environments where saving lives required the kind of calm under pressure that cannot be taught in a classroom and cannot be faked under fire. He received a Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration the Navy awards, for valor during an operation in the Kunar province of Afghanistan in 2017. The citation describes him pulling 2 teammates from a vehicle that had been disabled by an IED, returning fire against multiple enemy positions while doing so, and then carrying one of those teammates, who had sustained a broken leg and a gunshot wound to the shoulder, 4 kilometers through mountainous terrain in darkness to reach any extraction point. He did this with a radio that had been damaged in the initial blast and a team that was down to its last magazine of ammunition. He received the medal at a quiet ceremony. His mother kept the citation in a frame on the wall of her living room in Savannah, next to a photograph of Darnell in uniform at his BUD/S graduation. She showed it to anyone who visited. He never mentioned it. By the time the night at the gas station occurred, Darnell had transitioned out of active SEAL service and was working as a federal security consultant, advising government agencies on threat assessment and operational planning. The nature of his work meant that he regularly drove to facilities that were not publicly identified and met with people whose names he was not permitted to share. On that particular Tuesday in April, he had spent 12 hours at one such facility 40 miles outside of Millfield. He was driving home. His tank was nearly empty. He stopped at the Gas and Go on Route 7 because it was the nearest station on his route, because he wanted a bottle of water for the drive, and because he had stopped there a dozen times before without incident. He had no reason to expect that this time would be different. He had every reason to know, from experience, that it could be. Officer Craig Briggs had been with the Millfield Police Department for 9 years at the time of the incident. He was 34 years old, a local man who had grown up in the north end of Millfield, attended the county's public schools, and joined the department at 25 after 2 years of working private security at a mall in the next county over. His official record, the one his department maintained and the one that had been reviewed and approved in annual performance evaluations, described a dedicated officer with above-average arrest numbers, strong case closure rates, and 2 commendations. One for assisting at the scene of a traffic accident that involved a multi-vehicle collision on the interstate, and one for a community outreach initiative he had participated in at a local elementary school. That was the official record. The other record, the one that lived in complaint files, in the memories of Millfield's black residents, and in the settlement documents of at least one civil lawsuit, told a different story entirely. In 9 years on the force, Craig Briggs had accumulated 4 formal complaints alleging excessive use of force. Each complaint had been reviewed by the department's Internal Affairs Division. Each one had been closed without a finding of misconduct. The reasons given varied. Insufficient evidence, conflicting witness accounts, determination that the officer's actions were within policy guidelines, but the pattern was consistent. The complaints were filed, the investigations were opened, the files were closed. Briggs returned to duty. Nothing changed. In 2021, a 19-year-old college student named Marcus Trent filed a civil lawsuit against Craig Briggs and the city of Millfield, alleging that Briggs had slammed his head against the hood of a police cruiser during a traffic stop, injuring his neck and causing a concussion that required a hospital visit and 2 weeks of missed classes. Trent had been stopped for a broken tail light. He had committed no crime. The stop had produced no arrest. It had produced, according to the lawsuit, a trip to the emergency room and a fear of driving in Millfield that Trent said he still lived with years later. The city settled the lawsuit for $47,000. A non-disclosure agreement was signed. There was no admission of wrongdoing. Briggs was not disciplined. He was not retrained. He was not flagged in any early warning system because the Millfield Police Department did not have one. Among the residents of Millfield's East Side neighborhood, a predominantly black community that made up roughly a third of the city's population, Craig Briggs had a reputation that was spoken about in specific terms. He was the officer who would pull you over and find a reason to make the stop last 40 minutes. He was the officer who would ask you where you were going and where you had been and why you had chosen that particular road at that particular time, as if the act of driving while black required an alibi. He was the officer who stood too close, spoke too quietly, and seemed to be daring you to react so that he would have a justification for what came next. The residents of East Side had a name for him. They called him the Hunter, not because he was effective in the traditional sense, but because of the way he moved through their streets. Always searching, always ready, always finding reasons where none existed. His supervisors knew about the complaints. The chief of police, a man named Gerald Whitmore, who had led the department for 7 years, had personally reviewed each internal affairs file. He had seen the pattern. He had chosen, for reasons that would later become a central issue in the civil lawsuit, to describe Briggs in a 2022 performance evaluation as an assertive officer with strong instincts who sometimes required recalibration in community relations. Recalibration. That was the language the chief used for a man with 4 excessive force complaints and a settled civil lawsuit. Recalibration, not termination, not suspension, not mandatory retraining or psychological evaluation or any of the other interventions that policing experts would later testify in a federal courtroom could and should have been applied long before the night at the gas station on Route 7. The system that was supposed to catch officers like Craig Briggs before they caused irreparable harm had looked directly at him year after year and decided he was not worth catching. At 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in April, a 911 call was placed from inside the Millfield Gas and Go on Route 7. The caller was a gas station employee named Devin Walsh, 22 years old, working the night shift. He reported seeing a suspicious man in the parking lot. Heavyset, he said, wearing a red jacket, carrying a large duffel bag. He said the man had been in the parking lot for several minutes and was making him nervous. He said he thought something might be wrong. The dispatch log records the call at 9:47 and 12 seconds. It records the assignment of Officer Craig Briggs at 9:48 and 31 seconds. It records Briggs acknowledging the call at 9:49 and 4 seconds. His cruiser entered the Gas and Go parking lot at 9:49 and 58 seconds. The surveillance system at the Gas and Go was a 6-camera setup that had been installed 2 years earlier by the station's owner, Gerald Ossie, after a string of late-night robberies in the area had convinced him that visibility was his best protection. The cameras were positioned to cover the parking lot entrance, the pump islands from 2 different angles, the interior of the store, the rear exit, and the register. Each camera recorded in high definition with a timestamp overlay and audio capture within a 15-foot radius. The system backed up automatically to a cloud server every 6 hours. Gerald Ossie had paid for the best system he could afford because he had learned in 20 years of building a business in America that the truth was only useful if it was preserved. When Craig Briggs stepped out of his cruiser and entered the frame of camera 1 at 9:49 and 58 seconds, there were 3 customers visible in the parking lot. An elderly white woman was at pump 2, filling a sedan. A Latino man in his 40s was at pump 6, washing his windshield with the squeegee from the plastic bucket beside the pump. And at pump 4, a black man in a gray hoodie and jeans was standing beside a dark gray SUV, one hand on the pump handle, the other resting loosely at his side. He was reading the text on the pump display. He was not doing anything else. Craig Briggs scanned the parking lot for approximately 4 seconds. Then he walked directly to pump 4. He did not approach the woman at pump 2. He did not approach the man at pump 6. He walked in a straight line across the parking lot to the only black man present and positioned himself 6 feet away with his right hand already resting near his belt. The timestamp on camera 2, which captured this moment from the north position, reads 9:50 and 22 seconds. Darnell Carter became aware of the officer's approach in the way that people who have been trained to maintain situational awareness become aware of things, not through an obvious reaction, but through a slight recalibration. His eyes moved to the reflection in the SUV's window. He registered the uniform, the posture, the deliberate trajectory of the approach. He completed the thought he had been having about the pump display, whether he was going to fill the tank completely or just get enough to reach home. And then he set that thought aside because something more immediate required his attention. He had felt this particular quality of attention before, not in combat zones where the threat was visible and the rules of engagement were defined, but in parking lots and gas stations and grocery store aisles across this country where the threat wore a badge and the rules of engagement were written in a language that black men learned to read not in classrooms, but in the accumulated experiences of their lifetimes. He knew what it meant when an officer walked directly toward you across an empty parking lot. He knew what the hand near the belt signaled. He knew this was not going to be a friendly conversation. What he did not know was that 6 cameras were recording everything. The encounter began with the officer identifying himself and asking what Darnell was doing. Darnell responded calmly that he was pumping gas, which was visibly, demonstrably true. Briggs told him there had been a report of suspicious behavior in the area and asked where Darnell was coming from. Darnell said he had been working. Briggs asked where. Darnell said he worked as a federal contractor and that the specifics of his work were not something he could discuss. This answer, accurate, professional, and entirely reasonable given the classified nature of his employment, appeared to irritate Briggs immediately. The cameras captured the shift in his expression, the narrowing of the eyes, the slight forward lean that changed the geometry of the conversation from a question to something more like a challenge. Briggs demanded identification. Darnell paused for a deliberate moment, not out of defiance, but out of the awareness that how he moved in the next few seconds mattered enormously, and then slowly reached toward his back pocket to retrieve his wallet. His movements were exaggerated in their slowness. Both palms were visible at all times. He had been in situations where a man reaching for anything too quickly became the justification for violence. He was not going to give anyone that justification. He handed his license to Briggs with 2 fingers extended, the other 3 open and away from his body. The camera at pump 3 captured this in close detail. Briggs took the license and examined it for a length of time that was not consistent with reading a name and verifying a photograph. He studied it. He turned it slightly as if looking for something printed at an angle. He looked up at Darnell and back at the license 3 times. There was nothing wrong with the identification. It was a valid Georgia driver's license with a current address and an accurate photograph. The extended examination was not procedural. It was performative, a demonstration of authority for its own sake, in a parking lot with no audience, or so Briggs believed. When the examination finally ended, Briggs handed the license back and told Darnell to open his trunk. Darnell asked on what grounds. Briggs said he had received a report of suspicious activity. Darnell said he understood that, but asked what specific activity was being alleged, because he had not done anything wrong and was not consenting to a search without either probable cause or a warrant. The response was reasonable, legally accurate, and delivered without raised voice or aggressive posture. Darnell's tone, captured clearly by the camera audio, was the tone of a man who was being careful and controlled because he knew that being anything else could cost him everything. Briggs did not answer the question about probable cause. He did not explain what specific behavior had triggered the request to search the vehicle. He repeated the demand. Darnell repeated that he was not consenting, and then something shifted. The cameras captured it across multiple angles simultaneously. Briggs moved forward without warning. His right hand came off his belt and gripped Darnell's left forearm above the wrist with the kind of force that the medical examination would later describe as consistent with causing bruising in soft tissue. He pulled Darnell's arm and rotated him toward the side of the SUV in a single motion. Darnell's chest struck the door panel with enough force that the camera audio picked it up as a distinct, hard sound. Not a scrape or a brush, but an impact. The pump nozzle swung away from the fuel port and clattered against the side of the car. Darnell's water bottle, which he had been holding in his right hand, dropped to the concrete and rolled under the vehicle. At pump 2, the elderly woman stopped what she was doing and stood completely still, her hand frozen on her own pump handle. At pump 6, the man with the windshield squeegee had set it down in the bucket and was watching. And at the entrance to the parking lot, a dark blue hatchback had just pulled in and stopped. The driver was a 23-year-old college student named Jasmine Okafor, who had stopped for gas on her way home from a late study session at the university library. She had turned off her engine. She had looked up through her windshield. She had seen a police officer slam a man against a vehicle, and she had picked up her phone. The search that followed was conducted without consent, without probable cause, and without legal justification. Briggs searched Darnell's pockets, his waistband, his jacket. He went through the gym bag in the back seat with his hands. He checked the center console and the glove compartment. The entire process was captured by cameras 2 and 3 simultaneously, both angles running uninterrupted, the timestamp advancing second by second through every moment of it. Darnell stood against the vehicle with his palms flat against the door panel and his feet apart and his voice steady, speaking clearly and continuously into the air, stating for any record that might be listening that he had committed no crime, to get beshiet and stay for bus, no cried, that he had not consented to this search, that this stop had no legal basis, and that he was cooperating physically under duress and not voluntarily. He was creating a verbal record to match the visual one. He had learned at some point in his life that the truth needed documentation, because without documentation, the truth could be rewritten by the person holding the badge. The search found nothing. There was no weapon. There were no drugs. There was no contraband of any kind. There was a wallet, a phone, car keys, a federal contractor badge that Darnell was not required to show and did not show, a pair of wireless headphones, a receipt from a restaurant near the federal facility, and a half-empty water bottle in the bag. Nothing suspicious, nothing illegal, nothing that justified a single moment of what had just occurred. When Briggs stepped back, he said nothing about what the search had failed to find. He said nothing about the lack of probable cause. He did not apologize. He told Darnell he could go. The words were delivered as if the preceding 7 minutes had been a reasonable use of everyone's time. As if Briggs had done something procedurally correct that had simply come up empty rather than something unlawful that had been conducted against an innocent man with his hands pressed against the cold metal of his own car. Darnell turned around slowly. He straightened his hoodie. He picked up the pump nozzle that had fallen and returned it to the holder. Then he asked for the officer's name and badge number. He said it quietly. He said it once. He did not raise his voice. It was the moment everything changed. Briggs had taken 4 steps back toward his cruiser when the question reached him. He stopped. He turned around. And then he did something that the cameras recorded from 3 separate angles with absolute clarity. He walked back toward Darnell and without a word of explanation, shoved him hard against the side of the SUV with both hands. Not a push. A shove. The kind that drove Darnell's elbow into the doorframe with a crack that made Jasmine Okafor flinch in her car 30 feet away. The kind that made the elderly woman at pump 2 step backward. The kind that made the man at pump 6 take out his own phone. Darnell did not fall. He did not swing back. He did not raise his hands or his voice. He straightened again, slowly, and stood facing the officer with an expression the cameras captured in extraordinary detail. Not fear, not rage, but something that combined the two into something older and more exhausted than either. The expression of a man who had been here before, in some form, and had survived it before, and was focused entirely on surviving it again. In her car by the entrance, Jasmine Okafor was already recording. Her hands were shaking. She would say this later, in the interview she gave to a local television station, that aired 6 days after the incident, that her hands had been shaking the whole time she was filming, and that she had almost put the phone down twice because she was afraid of what might happen if Briggs saw her. But she had kept recording because she could not imagine what would happen to that man by the pump if no one kept recording. While Jasmine Okafor sat in her car recording and waiting for whatever was going to happen next, Gerald Ossie was inside his gas station. He had seen the commotion through the window. The police cruiser, the officer at Pump 4, the way the black man in the gray hoodie had been pushed against the car. Gerald had not gone outside. He had made a calculation that going outside as a black immigrant in Georgia at nearly 10 o'clock at night was not something that would improve the situation for anyone. Instead, he had gone to the back office where his surveillance system monitor was running, and he had sat down in front of the screen, and he had watched. He saw everything on the monitors, all 6 angles, the timestamps ticking forward, the search, the shove, the moment Darnell asked for the badge number, the second shove. He watched Craig Briggs finally get back in his cruiser and pull out of the parking lot at 10 minutes past 10. He watched Darnell stand still for a long moment after the cruiser disappeared, and then slowly walk to the driver's side of his SUV and sit down heavily in the seat. Gerald Ossie was on the phone with his attorney before Darnell had started his engine. Jasmine Okafor uploaded her video to social media at 11:17 p.m. She captioned it with a description of what she had witnessed. A police officer stopping a black man who was pumping gas, searching him without cause, and physically assaulting him when he asked for a badge number. She tagged 3 local news accounts and 2 racial justice organizations. She said she did not know who the man was. She said that didn't matter. By midnight, the video had 42,000 views. By 6 a.m. the following morning, it had crossed 800,000. By the time the local news stations had made the story their lead segment at noon, the video had been shared by national civil rights organizations, political figures, veterans groups, and military communities across the country, because by then, the identity of the man at Pump 4 had been reported, and his identity changed the story in a way that no one, least of all Craig Briggs, had anticipated. Darnell Carter was a Navy SEAL, decorated, 3 combat deployments, a Navy Cross for Valor, a man who had spent 11 years doing things in service to this country that most people would never know about and that he would never be permitted to fully describe. A man who had survived BUD/S, who had carried a wounded teammate 4 kilometers through a mountain in the dark, who had faced enemy fire in 3 countries, who had returned home from all of it and had asked for nothing except to be treated like a human being going about his life. The country reacted as if it had been struck. Veterans organizations that had never publicly commented on police misconduct cases issued statements. Military communities that operated in largely separate cultural spaces from racial justice movements found themselves aligned for the first time in outrage. The story crossed every demographic boundary that these stories usually cannot cross, because the person at the center of it was impossible to dismiss, impossible to reframe, impossible to make into something he was not. He was a decorated American war hero who had been shoved against his own car by a police officer in a gas station parking lot for asking for a badge number. The cameras had recorded every second of it. There was no version of the story that made Craig Briggs the reasonable party. The Millfield Police Department issued a statement the following afternoon. It called the footage concerning. It announced an internal review. It asked the public to withhold judgment while the process played out. The statement was issued at 2:47 p.m. By 3:30, 4 city council members had released their own statements calling for immediate action rather than process. By 5 p.m., the mayor had called the police chief personally. By 7 p.m., Craig Briggs had been placed on unpaid administrative leave. It was not enough. The public understood, from years of watching internal reviews produce nothing, that unpaid administrative leave was the beginning of a process that historically ended with the officer returning to duty and the community returning to silence. The public was not in the mood for that outcome this time. Protesters appeared outside the police station the following morning. Not hundreds of people, not a massive demonstration, but a steady, persistent presence of citizens holding signs and standing in the cold and refusing to go away. They came back, the next day, and the day after. They were not going away until they got something more than a concerned statement and a temporary leave. Darnell retained a civil rights attorney named Amara Diallo 3 days after the incident. Diallo was a 51-year-old woman who had spent 20 years working police misconduct cases in Georgia and the surrounding states. She had won cases and she had lost cases, and she had learned to tell the difference early before resources were committed and expectations were raised. When she sat down with Darnell and reviewed the surveillance footage from all 6 cameras, plus Jasmine Okafor's phone video, plus the audio capture from cameras 2 and 3, she told him something she had not said to many clients in 2 decades of practice. She told him this case was as clean as she had ever seen. Clean meant provable. It meant that every element of Craig Briggs's conduct that constituted a legal violation was documented with a precision that left no room for the alternative narratives that defense attorneys use to muddy the waters in cases like this. There was no moment where Darnell's behavior could be characterized as threatening. There was no ambiguity about who had initiated physical contact. There was no dispute about whether the search had produced evidence of wrongdoing. It hadn't, and the cameras showed that Briggs had known that and had shoved Darnell anyway. The footage did not tell a story that required interpretation. It told a story that required only the ability to see. Diallo filed on 2 tracks simultaneously. The first was a criminal complaint submitted directly to the district attorney's office, bypassing the police department entirely and the internal review process that had protected Briggs for 9 years. The charges she sought were assault under color of authority, official oppression, and civil rights violations, a combination that carried the possibility of significant prison time if the jury agreed with the evidence. The second track was a civil lawsuit against Craig Briggs personally and against the city of Millfield for what Diallo characterized as a pattern of institutional negligence, the systematic failure to respond to complaint patterns, the settlement of the Marcus Trent lawsuit without accountability, the performance review that described a man with 4 excessive force complaints as merely requiring recalibration. The district attorney, a woman named Carolyn Marsh who had campaigned on a platform of reforming how her office handled police misconduct, reviewed the footage within 24 hours of receiving the complaint. She convened a grand jury 9 days after the incident. The grand jury returned an indictment on all counts in less than 3 hours. Craig Briggs was formally indicted 12 days after the gas station encounter. He was fired from the Millfield Police Department the same afternoon. His law enforcement certification was suspended pending. The outcome of the criminal proceedings, effectively ending any possibility of working as a police officer in the state while the case was active. The trial began 6 months later. The prosecution's case was organized around a simple principle: show the jury what the cameras showed. There was no need for elaborate legal argument when the evidence was a series of high-definition videos with time-stamped audio that documented every moment of the encounter with the kind of clarity that courtroom evidence almost never achieved. The jury watched the parking lot footage. They watched from camera 2 and camera 3 simultaneously, 2 angles of the same moment, the way a film editor would cut between shots to ensure nothing was missed. They watched Darnell's careful, deliberate movements. They watched Briggs's hand move to his belt. They watched the search that found nothing. They watched the shove that came after he asked for a badge number. Darnell testified for 3 hours. He was composed throughout. He answered every question directly and completely. He described what he had felt during the encounter, not just the physical sensations of being pushed against his own car, but the particular psychological experience of being a black man in America who understood exactly what was happening and why, and who also understood that how he responded to it could determine whether he went home that night. He described the training that allowed him to stay calm under conditions that most people would find impossible to endure without reaction. He described the point at which he realized the search had found nothing and that Briggs was going to walk away. And he described why he had still asked for the badge number, knowing it might escalate things. He said he had asked because documentation was the only protection available to him, and he had learned a long time ago that protection was something you had to build for yourself. The defense strategy collapsed in stages. The first argument, that Briggs had felt genuinely threatened by Darnell's physical presence, was undermined by the footage showing Darnell standing with a pump handle and a water bottle when first approached. The second argument, that Darnell's responses during the encounter had been uncooperative, was undermined by the audio, which captured Darnell being unfailingly polite and procedurally precise throughout. The third argument, that the physical contact had been within standard use of force guidelines, was demolished by 3 use of force experts who testified, independently and consistently, that nothing in Briggs's documented interactions with Darnell met the legal threshold for physical intervention at any point during the encounter. The jury deliberated for 2 hours and 11 minutes before returning guilty on all counts. The judge, a woman named Honorable Patricia Odom, who had spent 30 years on the bench and had watched more cases than she could count end without consequence for the officer involved, spoke for 14 minutes before announcing the sentence. She talked about the meaning of public trust. She talked about the particular damage done when the people charged with protecting a community become a source of fear within it. She talked about Craig Briggs's history, the complaints, the settlement, the performance review that called him a man who required recalibration. And she said that the institution that allowed that history to accumulate without intervention bore responsibility for what had happened in that parking lot. She sentenced Craig Briggs to 3 years and 8 months in state prison, the maximum the sentencing guidelines permitted. In the gallery, someone began to cry quietly. It was not Darnell. He sat at the plaintiff's table and absorbed the verdict with the same stillness he had shown at Pump 4. He had practiced stillness for a long time. He was good at it. The civil case settled 8 weeks after the criminal verdict. The city of Millfield agreed to pay Darnell Carter $1.2 million in damages. The number was significant, but both Amara Diallo and Darnell himself had made clear from the beginning of the civil proceedings that the monetary settlement was not the primary objective. The primary objective was structural change. The kind of change that would make it more difficult for the next Craig Briggs to exist in this department, or in any department that looked at this case and decided it did not want to become the next cautionary example. As a condition of the settlement, the city of Millfield agreed to a consent decree that required the following: independent civilian oversight of the police department, with a review board that had the actual authority to investigate complaints and recommend consequences, rather than the advisory-only function that such boards typically held. A mandatory early warning system that would automatically flag officers for supervisory review when they accumulated 2 or more use-of-force complaints within a rolling 12-month period. Mandatory retraining in de-escalation and implicit bias for every officer on the force, with the training conducted by external instructors rather than the department's own personnel, and the public release of all body camera and surveillance footage related to use-of-force incidents within 21 days, unless there existed a specific and documented legal reason for delay. The police chief, Gerald Whitmore, resigned 2 weeks after the settlement was announced. The city council hired an outside firm to conduct a full review of the department's complaint handling processes going back 10 years. The review identified 37 cases in which complaint files had been closed without adequate investigation. 17 of those cases involved officers who were still active on the force. 6 of them involved officers who had subsequently been promoted. The review was published in full, every page of it, on the city's public records website, accessible to anyone who wanted to read it. Gerald Ossie, the gas station owner whose 6-camera surveillance system had made all of this possible, upgraded his system the following year to 8 cameras with higher resolution sensors and a direct upload connection to a legal preservation service that maintained archived footage for 7 years. He told a reporter from the local paper that he had always believed in keeping good records. He said the past year had confirmed that belief more thoroughly than anything else in his 20 years of running a business. Devin Walsh, the gas station employee who had made the initial 911 call that brought Briggs to the parking lot, gave an interview to a podcast that covered the case. He said he had called because he had been nervous and because his supervisor had told him to call if he ever saw anything that seemed off. He said he had described the person he saw in the parking lot as accurately as he could: heavyset, red jacket, duffel bag. He said he had not been describing Darnell Carter because Darnell Carter was not heavyset, was not wearing red, and was not carrying a duffel bag. He said he did not understand, even now, how the officer had decided that Darnell Carter was the person the call was about. He said he thought about it a lot. Jasmine Okafor finished her degree the following spring. She spoke at her university's convocation ceremony about the night she had sat in a parking lot with her hands shaking and kept recording anyway. She said she had done it because she could not imagine not doing it. She said that was the thing she wanted people to understand. Not that she was brave, but that the threshold for bravery was lower than people thought. You just had to keep the camera steady. Darnell Carter left his federal consulting work 14 months after the incident at the gas station. It was not a decision made in anger or in reaction to what had happened to him. It was a decision made in the same deliberate way he made most decisions, and by assessing what the mission was and determining where he could do the most good. He had spent 11 years protecting Americans from threats that originated overseas. He had spent a year watching what happened when an American tried to fight back against a threat that wore a badge and a uniform and operated behind the protection of institutional silence. He had decided that the second mission needed him more than the first one did right now. He started a non-profit organization called the Fourth Watch. The name came from military terminology for the final duty rotation before dawn. The shift that ran from roughly 2 in the morning until 6, when most people were asleep and a small number of people were awake and paying attention, keeping watch on behalf of everyone who trusted that someone was paying attention. He chose the Ain name because that was what he felt this work required. Not heroics, not spectacle, just the sustained, unglamorous work of staying awake and paying attention when it would be easier to go to sleep. The foundation did 3 things. First, it connected victims of police misconduct with attorneys, a network of civil rights lawyers across the state who had agreed to take on cases at reduced fees or pro bono when the evidence warranted it. Darnell had learned from his own experience that the difference between a case that achieved accountability and a case that was buried was often not the strength of the evidence, but the resources available to the person who had been wronged. He wanted to reduce the role that financial circumstance played in determining who got justice. Second, the foundation trained community members in documentation, not just how to record video on a phone, most people already knew how to do that, but how to record in ways that preserved legal admissibility. How to back up footage immediately to prevent loss or tampering. how to document injuries with photographs and medical records, how to write detailed contemporaneous accounts of what had happened while the memory was still fresh. Documentation, Darnell had learned, was the foundation of accountability. Without it, the truth was just a claim. With it, the truth was evidence. Third, the foundation worked on policy. Amara Diallo joined the foundation's board as its legal director, and together she and Darnell engaged with city councils, police oversight commissions, and state legislators to push for the kinds of structural changes that the Millfield settlement had produced. Early warning systems, independent oversight, mandatory footage disclosure to be adopted as standard policy rather than the result of individual lawsuits. It was slow work. It was the kind of work that rarely generated headlines. It was the kind of work that mattered enormously over time. Darnell traveled extensively for the foundation, speaking in community centers and church halls and university auditoriums to audiences of young black men and women about their constitutional rights during police encounters. He explained what officers could and could not legally compel. He explained the difference between a request and a requirement. He explained how to stay safe while asserting dignity, the specific, practical calculus of that balance that black Americans had been working out for themselves across generations without anyone sitting down to teach it systematically. He brought in legal experts to supplement what he knew from personal experience. He brought in retired officers who talked about what they had witnessed inside departments and what they wished they had done differently. He tried to make the sessions useful rather than just cathartic. He did not talk much about his Navy SEAL career in public. Some of it remained classified and would remain classified. Some of it, he felt, belonged to the men he had served with and was not his to share as a personal story. When he did mention it, he was careful to frame it not as a credential that made his experience more valid than anyone else's, but as context for the particular irony that he had encountered. He had survived things in service to this country that most people would find unimaginable. He had not survived a gas station on Route 7 unscathed. That contradiction said something about America that he thought was worth saying out loud, carefully, without embellishment. Craig Briggs was released from state prison 2 years and 10 months into his sentence, with several months removed for good behavior. He left Georgia shortly after his release. His name appeared in the years that followed in police training curricula across the country as a case study in the failure of early intervention systems, an example used to argue that if departments identified and addressed problematic behavior patterns before, they escalated. Incidents like the one at the Gas and Go on Route 7 could be prevented. He had become, in his absence, exactly the kind of cautionary example that had never reached him when it might have made a difference. He has never, in any forum or through any representative, acknowledged that what he did was wrong. A gas station on Route 7, Pump 4. A Tuesday night in April at 9 minutes and 50 seconds past 9 p.m. when a police cruiser pulled into a parking lot and an officer walked past 2 other customers and directly to the one black man present and asked him what he was doing there. 6 cameras recorded what happened next. Every angle, every second, every word. The system backed up to the cloud automatically, the way Gerald Osai had designed it to, because he had understood, long before any of this happened, that the truth needed to be preserved in a form that could survive an attempt to erase it. 9 minutes and 12 seconds of footage. That is what it took. To end one man's career, begin one man's second mission, force a police department into structural reform, and send a message, imperfect, incomplete, dependent on the presence of cameras and willing witnesses and sufficient resources to fight, that accountability was possible, not guaranteed, not automatic, not the default outcome of injustice in this country, but possible. When everything lined up, when the cameras were running, when the woman in the parking lot kept her phone steady, when the man who owned the station called his attorney before he called anyone else, when the man at the pump kept his hands visible and his voice calm and his documentation precise, because he had learned what all of this required. The question that this story asks, the question that Darnell Carter asks when he speaks in community centers and church halls and university auditoriums, is not whether it should have required all of that. It should not have. The question is what we do, knowing that it does. What Darnell Carter decided to do was stay awake, pay attention, keep the cameras running, teach other people how to do the same. That is the fourth watch, and it is still running. If this story stayed with you, share it. Because Darnell was right about something. Luck should not be what justice depends on, but visibility can change the odds. The more people who know how to document, how to witness, how to stay steady when it matters, the smaller the role that luck has to play. If you are new here, subscribe. Every story on this channel exists because someone kept the camera rolling. That is why we are here. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. And tell me this, Have you or someone you know ever been in a situation like Darnell's? What happened? I read every single comment. Every one.